A top North Korean official heads to the United States to prepare the country's historic summit. General Kim Yong-chol is the most senior figure to visit America for almost 20 years. He'll meet the Secretary of State Mike Pompeo. Just how do ordinary North Koreans view their lives and their leader? We hear stories from inside the secretive country.
People cannot survive in the prison camps. They unconditionally beat you. Once you go there, you are no longer a citizen.
Russia denies it's involved in the death of a vocal Kremlin critic shot outside his apartment in Ukraine. And as Roseanne Barr's racist tweets gets her series cancelled, how can you limit the damage when showbiz stars press the self-destruct button? That's all coming up here on Impact. Hello and welcome to the programme. I'm Yalda Hakim. Our top story on Impact today. It's been nearly 20 years since North Korea sent such a senior official to the United States. General Kim Yong-chol is actually under US sanctions, which would normally stop him travelling. But in a sign of just how serious both sides are about a future summit, the general is now on his way to New York for a meeting with the Secretary of State Mike Pompeo. It comes as American negotiators on the North Korean border continue with their preparations. All in all, a sharp turnaround from the war of words that we saw last week. Well, let's get more now from David Oh, who's with the BBC Korean service, and he joins us now from Seoul. David, good to see you. I mean, there's a lot of shuttle diplomacy that's going on at the moment.
Yes, correct. As you mentioned, that now the U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo and the Kim Yong-chol, one of the highest-ranking North Korean officials, are to meet in New York, which hasn't seen before. And Kim Yong-chol is the most highest-ranked North Korean official visiting United States. But before that, I have to mention that there has been another meetings in South Korea, actually in the demilitarized zone between North and South Korea. The U.S. officials and North Korean officials met today, starting from 10 a.m. this morning, and the meeting lasts until 2 p.m. This afternoon in Korean time. The meeting include the high officials from Sung Kim, the U.S. ambassador to Philippines, and also Choi Sun-hee, North Korean foreign officials. And they discussed several issues. We expect that they also discussed what the two leaders would discuss at the summit, which are happening, we want happening, or we expecting happening on the June 12th in Singapore.
And David, I mean, in the last few days, a lot of analysts have said that this meeting, if it does go ahead on June the 12th, would be just symbolic. But with all of these different meetings taking place and all of these different players now involved, it does feel like it might be a little bit more than just symbolic.
It is. I think, as we all know, that the key issue at the moment is the denuclearization of North Korea's nuclear weapons and missile programs. As we all know now that the United States and North Korea have a clear difference on their agenda. The United States want to have at once to clear all the nuclear weapons and bring these nuclear weapons and nuclear programs to the United States. However, North Korea does not want to do that. They want to add a step-by-step approach, which means they want a step forward and they receive a financial aid or economic aid, which we expecting that the Mike Pompeo and Kim Yong-chol would discuss this, which likely happening this morning or this afternoon in Washington, or in Washington time in New York.
Tell us about the mood there in Seoul. Are people optimistic? Are they cautious about the fact that this meeting could be potentially cancelled or may not go ahead? How are they feeling?
Well, it's been a very dramatic event happening, well, I have to say, since January this year, when Kim Jong-un released a speech that he wants to open up and discuss things with the other countries, including South Korea and the United States. And as we know that in April, the South Korean leader Moon Jae-in and North Korean leader Kim Jong-un met in Panmunjom, which symbolized the country's event. But we South Koreans had a great expectation that this summit between North Korea and the United States happening in Singapore. But when the Trump released a letter canceling the event, there were a bit concerns what they cannot do at this time. But as a South Korean, there is a consensus that this is a rare opportunity for both North Korea and South Korea and on the Korean Peninsula and on the whole. And this will be a chance that moving forward. So there is a high expectations on the meeting between Donald Trump and North Korean leader Kim Jong-un.
David O joining us there from Seoul. Thank you very much. And a little later on Impact, we'll have a special report on what North Koreans actually think about their country and their leader. So do stay with us for that. Now, to the rest of the day's news. Ukrainian police believe a prominent Russian journalist and outspoken critic of President Putin may have been murdered at his home in Kiev because of his work. Arkady Babchenko had been openly critical of Moscow's involvement in Syria and in eastern Ukraine. The Russian government has denied any involvement, as Jonah Fisher reports.
No one could accuse Arkady Babchenko of lacking courage. He fought as a soldier in Chechnya in the late 1990s and then became a war correspondent. With Russian forces in Ukraine and Syria, his coverage was fearless and outspoken in its criticism of Vladimir Putin. It made him powerful enemies, and early last year he fled Russia to Ukraine, fearing for his life. Sadly, Kiev proved no safer. On Tuesday night, Mr. Babchenko was shot several times in the back as he returned to his apartment from the local grocery store. It has all the hallmarks of a clinical assassination, and his friends have no doubt who's behind it.
He was one of the few who wrote the actual truth about what the Russian Federation is doing. And if it wasn't dangerous for them, if they didn't care about it, well, they wouldn't have killed him. It's calculated, deliberate international terrorist crime, committed on direct instructions from the Russian authorities.
The Ukrainian authorities have echoed that view in more circumspect terms. Russia has called for a full investigation.
The Ukrainian Prime Minister is already talking about how it was done by Russian secret services. An investigation has not yet begun, but now it probably will. This fashion of conducting international affairs is very sad.
At the crime scene, less than 24 hours on, there were plenty of journalists, but surprisingly few police. This isn't the first time a prominent critic of Vladimir Putin has been assassinated here in Kiev. And given past history, it's unlikely that the authorities will truly get to the bottom of what happened. If Russia, as many people believe, is behind this, it serves as a chilling reminder to dissidents and opponents that though they may flee the country, they must still fear for their lives. Jonah Fisher, BBC News, Kiev.
OK, let's look at some other stories making headlines here on Impact. Staying with Russia, a British financier and vocal critic of President Putin has been released after he was briefly detained in Madrid. Bill Browder was freed when Spanish police said they realised an Interpol warrant was out of date. Mr. Browder has accused corrupt officials of looting his investments in Russia. Malaysia's Prime Minister says that the hunt for the missing Malaysia Airlines flight MH370 may resume if new evidence comes to light. Mahathir Mohamed's comments come as a private search for the missing passenger plane draws to a close. And an Indonesian fashion designer has been sentenced to 18 years in jail for fraud. Anissa Hasabon, seen here talking to the BBC 2 years ago, put on the first fashion show to feature all models wearing headscarves. She and her husband have been found guilty of cheating customers who booked trips to Mecca through a travel agency they operated. Now, Chinese state media is warning that Beijing is ready to fight back after the United States announced it would go ahead with imposing new tariffs on Chinese goods. The plan is to impose 25% tariffs on $50 billion worth of products imported from China. Our correspondent Robin Brandt is in Shanghai and has more for us.
The threat of tariffs on actually up to $100 billion worth of Chinese goods exported from this country to the US is the big weapon that Donald Trump and those in his administration have been able to hold as they sit round the negotiating table. Now, after those talks in Washington a couple of weeks ago, they agreed to essentially put that weapon down, and the threat of a trade war was kind of taken off the table. But with Wilbur Ross, the US Commerce Secretary, due in Beijing in just a few days' time for round 3 of these face-to-face negotiations, it now appears that tariffs are back on the table. They will push ahead when it comes to next month. And in particular, this is about America's concern about the theft of intellectual property from a swathe of its companies, something it says China is doing for a long, long time. So now the prospect of $50 billion worth of trade going to the States hit by new tariffs is back on the table. And, you know, the sparring between these two sides, the tactical manoeuvres, they're changing kind of week by week. And I think what we are looking at is a prospect, certainly from the Trump administration's point of view, of a grand bargain here, a big deal about IP, about market access, about, you know, the tariffs charged on goods, maybe even involving North Korea as well. But in terms of the tone ahead of Wilbur Ross's arrival, you know, it doesn't look that good. But the US has decided to bring that big weapon and wield it again, tariffs, back at the negotiating table.
That was Robin Brandt giving us the latest there. Now, do stay with us here on Impact. Still to come, life inside North Korea. The BBC hears exclusive testimony from a network of dissidents.
In the biggest international sporting spectacle ever seen, up to 30 million people have taken part in sponsored athletics events to aid famine relief in Africa.
The first of what the makers of Star Wars hope will be thousands of queues started forming at 7 a.m.
Taunting which led to scuffles, scuffles to fighting, fighting to full-scale riot, as the Liverpool fans broke out of their area and into the Juventus enclosure. The Belgian police had lost control.
The whole world who will mourn the tragic death of Mr. Nehru today. He was the father of the Indian people from the day of independence.
The Oprah Winfrey Show comes to an end after 25 years and more than 4,500 episodes. The chat show has made her one of the richest people on the planet.
Geri Halliwell, otherwise known as Ginger Spice, has announced she's left the Spice Girls.
I don't believe it. She's the one with the bounce, the go, girl power. Not Geri. Why?
Hello again, I'm Yalda Hakim. You're watching Impact from the BBC. Now, as speculation continues about the possibility of a summit between President Trump and Kim Jong-un, the debate about North Korea's record on human rights has been largely sidelined. Direct testimony from within North Korea is exceptionally hard to record, but over many months, the BBC has used a covert network of dissidents to put questions to a range of citizens. As Michael Cohen reports, they express strong views about the country's leadership and relations with the rest of the world.
North Korea is the world's most repressive regime. Ruled by the totalitarian Kim dynasty, the authorities wield an absolute control over information. Citizens' mobile phones can't call outside the country, and they have no access to the internet. Using a covert network over many months, we've been able to put questions to 2 ordinary North Koreans. They'd face retribution for this type of communication, so we're concealing their identities. Chol Ho is a father who works in the military. Sun Hui is a market trader who lives with her husband and 2 daughters. They told us about the power of the state and the country's notorious labor camps.
Sometimes the State Security Department get people by calling them spies. They make up stories for their own performance. They make people say that they were planning to go to China and then report them.
Here there are a lot of government captures, people arrested and taken away. People cannot survive in the prison camps. They unconditionally beat you. They starve you while doing extreme labor. Once you go there, you are no longer a citizen. I think this terror is what keeps society going.
In North Korea, it is illegal to criticize the regime and carries severe punishment.
People say that Kim Jong-un acts the same as us, but takes away our money a lot. That the little man uses his head to suck up money like a vampire. The number of people who assess him positively is increasing.
In the 1990s, North Korea experienced a famine that left over 1 million people dead when the state couldn't fund its ration system. In response, black markets emerged across the country. Today, they serve as a lifeline to the population, with the regime reluctantly allowing this capitalist trade to grow. Without them, portions of the population would once again starve.
He leaves the markets alone and doesn't crack down much no matter what we do. Many people want things to continue the way it is.
And internally, there appears to be a softening in rhetoric towards the West.
Recently, they say we should be living in peace with America for everyone to have a better life.
Michael Cowan, BBC News.
Well, joining me now from Oxford is academic and author Ji-Yeon Baek, who interviewed many North Korean defectors for her book North Korea's Hidden Revolution, which looks at the network of citizens who take huge risks to bring banned foreign films and media into the country. Ji-Yeon, thanks very much for joining us here on the programme. The fact is, despite global optimism about North Korea at the moment, it still remains one of the most secretive states on earth.
Yes, it is absolutely a very sealed off country, and the government continues to invest tremendous resources to control the information that's distributed inside the country for its population's consumption.
You've spoken to many defectors for your book. Just tell us how difficult it was to gain that access, and also the kind of risks they were taking by talking to you.
Sure. So I spent well over a decade researching this topic, and so I was very privileged to organically build a lot of relationships and friendships with North Korean defectors, and so it took a long time to gain trust of many of these individuals, but it worked out quite well. And some of the individuals were taking a lot of risks talking about this issue because they're quite high-profile activists and advocates for North Korean human rights. But on the whole, a lot of the individuals they spoke with me in private and in private homes and cafes, and so it was not as risky as speaking to anyone inside North Korea.
And when you hear, our correspondent was just saying there that the attitude towards the West within the country is now softening, what do you think about that?
I think, it's hard to generalize across the whole country, and of course there's no way to gain any kind of truly representative set of understanding of what people may actually think about the West. But I think there is a changing trend of people's views towards the West, partly due to the foreign information coming in from the outside into North Korea. And so a lot of the rhetoric that people were raised on about how the West is, very an evil source of influence, I think that's eroding gradually. And so I think that Mr. Cohen's coverage is quite accurate.
And no doubt that state media would be covering the preparations for these summits, this potential summit between Donald Trump and Kim Jong-un quite differently to the way the rest of the world would be covering it.
Yes, and so I've looked into a little bit of the North Korean news that they broadcast for its citizens, and as you could imagine, it is quite different from the way that the preparations for the upcoming summit between the North Koreans and the U.S. is portrayed in this country, in the U.K., and the U.S. and elsewhere. It does place a lot of blame on the U.S. more so than I saw anywhere else, about the rocky road towards the summit. But I guess that's the way that the North Koreans have broadcast their news all this time.
And while we're not getting reports of the kind of famine that North Korea faced in the 90s, clearly there is some kind of will from within the country and the leadership to open its country up, to have some of these sanctions that are so crippling lifted.
Yes, so there has been a very strong emphasis by this current leader, Kim Jong-un, to develop the economy, for the North Korean economy, so formally and as well as informally. So there's been a lot of what we often hear about, these grassroots marketization phenomena that's been taking place across the country since the mid-1990s. The famine, as you mentioned, really did trigger this marketization across the country. And so in addition to the very kind of low-level market activity, there seems to be a lot of investment in the capital city and some of the other larger cities as well. But in terms of opening up in terms of liberalizing the country, I don't think North Korea is there yet. But there seems to be an emphasis on economic development for its people, for sure.